In just 8 hours and 47 minutes, $100 on billionaire spending became the most expensive political failure in New York history. 28 of America's wealthiest individuals had united in unprecedented conspiracy to stop one 34-year-old Democratic Socialist from becoming mayor. They deployed every weapon in the oligarch playbook: super PACs, media manipulation, corporate pressure, and political intimidation. But at 11:47 p.m. on November 4, 2025, when Zohran Mamdani's victory was declared, their money became worthless and their power became illusion. What did these billionaires spend $100 million on that backfired so spectacularly it actually helped elect the mayor? They tried to destroy. September 12, 2025, 7:30 p.m., the 47th floor conference room at Bloomberg LP headquarters commanded a breathtaking view of Manhattan's financial district. But the 28 men and women gathered around the mahogany table weren't admiring the skyline. They were plotting to prevent what they saw as an existential threat to American capitalism. Michael Bloomberg, the 82-year-old former mayor worth $94.5 billion, had called this emergency meeting of what would become known as the Committee to Preserve New York. The attendees represented $847 billion in combined wealth and controlled corporations employing millions of Americans. "Friends," Bloomberg began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd bought and sold political influence for decades, "we face an unprecedented threat to everything we've built in this city." Zohran Mamdani isn't just another progressive politician, he's a Democratic Socialist who wants to fundamentally alter the relationship between capital and government. The PowerPoint presentation Bloomberg's team had prepared was comprehensive and terrifying to people whose wealth depended on favorable government treatment. Mamdani's policy agenda would cost them billions: a 2% wealth tax on assets over $50 million, corporate tax increases, aggressive antitrust enforcement, and rent stabilization that would devastate real estate values. Hedge fund titan Bill Ackman, worth $4.1 billion, spoke first. "Michael, we all understand the stakes. But what exactly are you proposing? We can't simply buy an election like it's 2009. Bloomberg's answer revealed the sophistication of their strategy. "We're not buying an election, Bill. We're funding a comprehensive campaign to educate New Yorkers about the consequences of socialist governance, market-based solutions, job creation, fiscal responsibility, themes that resonate across party lines." The euphemistic language masked a coordinated attack campaign that would make Citizens United look like amateur hour. Real estate mogul Stephen Ross, owner of the Miami Dolphins and related companies, outlined the financial structure. "We've established 17 separate super PACs to maximize contribution limits while maintaining plausible independence. Each billionaire can contribute $1 million to multiple committees, effectively allowing unlimited spending while technically complying with campaign finance law." The legal architecture was brilliant and corrupt. By fragmenting their spending across multiple supposedly independent committees, the billionaires could pool resources while avoiding disclosure requirements that might reveal the conspiracy's scope. Walmart heiress Alice Walton, worth $65.3 billion, raised the crucial question: what assurance do we have that this spending will be effective? Traditional political advertising may not work against a candidate who's explicitly running against billionaire influence. Bloomberg's answer revealed months of strategic planning. "We're not running traditional ads, Alice. We're funding investigative journalism, think tank research, academic studies, community organization, and grassroots education. When New Yorkers reject Mamdani's agenda, it will seem like organic democratic opposition rather than billionaire manipulation." The strategy was sophisticated astroturfing designed to create artificial grassroots opposition while hiding billionaire funding. Voters would see seemingly independent criticism from multiple sources, unaware that every attack originated from the same coordinated conspiracy. Private equity kingpin David Rubenstein outlined the media component. "We've already secured commitments from 3 major PR firms, 2 opposition research companies, and a network of freelance journalists who'll investigate every aspect of Mamdani's record and policy proposals." Casino magnate Sheldon Adelson's widow, Miriam, worth $27.5 billion, emphasized the academic angle. The American Enterprise Institute, Manhattan Institute, and Brookings Institution have agreed to produce policy studies demonstrating the economic risks of Mamdani's agenda. When Ivy League economists warn about socialist overreach, voters listen. The intellectual infrastructure was crucial to their strategy. By funding seemingly independent academic research critical of Mamdani's policies, they could create scholarly legitimacy for political attacks. voters would hear economic criticism from prestigious institutions rather than recognizing billionaire propaganda. Netflix co-founder Reed Hastings detailed the digital component. We're funding social media campaigns, influencer partnerships, and targeted advertising across every platform. The algorithms will ensure that swing voters see content questioning Mamdani's competence and agenda. The technology strategy revealed how modern political manipulation operated through algorithmic amplification rather than traditional advertising. Billionaire funding would push anti-Mamdani content toward undecided voters without revealing the source of that content. Oracle founder Larry Ellison outlined the corporate pressure campaign. Major employers throughout New York will receive detailed analyses of how Mamdani's policies would affect their operations, tax burdens, and regulatory environment. Business opposition will seem economically motivated rather than politically coordinated. The corporate intimidation was designed to create economic anxiety about Mamdani's election. When major employers expressed concerns about his policies, voters would worry about job security without understanding that those concerns were orchestrated by competing billionaires. Dell Technologies founder Michael Dell explained the community organization strategy. We're funding neighborhood associations, business groups, and civic organizations that will host forums, debates, and educational events, highlighting the risks of socialist governance. The grassroots theater was perhaps the most insidious element of their strategy. By funding fake community opposition, they could create the illusion of widespread democratic resistance to Mamdani's agenda while hiding their own financial interests. Facebook co-founder Mark Zuckerberg, attending virtually from California, outlined the information warfare component. Our platforms will ensure that factual content about economic policy receives maximum distribution while monitoring for misinformation that might favor Mamdani's campaign. The tech censorship angle revealed how social media algorithms could be weaponized for political purposes. By defining pro-Mamdani content as misinformation while amplifying billionaire-funded criticism, they could control information flow to millions of voters. By September's end, the Committee to Preserve New York had committed $100.3 million to defeating Mamdani through this multi-pronged strategy. The spending was unprecedented in municipal politics, more than most governors spent in statewide races. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They underestimated both Mamdani's political sophistication and New York voters' intelligence. October 1, 2025. Mamdani's campaign headquarters in Queens buzzed with activity as volunteers and staff analyzed the sudden surge in opposition spending. Campaign manager Rebecca Katz had been tracking super PAC filings, media buys, and corporate statements that revealed the billionaire conspiracy's scope.
Zohran Katz said during their morning strategy meeting, "We're seeing coordinated opposition, unlike anything in New York political history. The spending is massive, the messaging is sophisticated, and the sources are deliberately obscured." Mamdani's response revealed his strategic thinking. "Rebecca, this is actually an opportunity. Every dollar they spend proves our central argument. Billionaires will do anything to maintain their power over working families. We need to make their opposition visible rather than hidden." The counter-strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than defensively responding to billionaire attacks, Mamdani would offensively expose the conspiracy itself. He would make billionaire opposition a campaign asset rather than a campaign liability. "I want a full investigation of every super PAC, every corporate statement, every think tank report, and every academic study criticizing our campaign." Mamdani instructed his research team. "We're going to show voters exactly who's funding this opposition and why." The opposition research revealed patterns that confirmed coordinated conspiracy. The same consulting firms managed multiple super PACs. The same academics authored studies for different think tanks. The same corporate executives funded various civic organizations. Everything traced back to the Bloomberg meeting and the Billionaire Committee. October 15, 2025. Mamdani held a press conference outside the Bloomberg LP building that would reframe the entire mayoral race. Standing where the billionaire conspiracy had been planned, he delivered a devastating expose of their $100 million campaign. "New Yorkers deserve to know who's really running against me in this election," Mamdani began, holding up a thick folder of financial documents. "It's not just Eric Adams or Andrew Cuomo. It's 28 billionaires who've spent over $100 million to maintain their control over our city." The revelation was explosive. Mamdani had connected the dots between seemingly independent opposition and coordinated billionaire funding. He named names, cited dollar amounts, and revealed the conspiracy's scope with prosecutorial precision. Michael Bloomberg, Bill Ackman, Alice Walton, Stephen Ross, and 24 other billionaires have formed a secret committee to defeat our campaign because they know we'll make them pay their fair share, Mamdani declared. Every attack ad, every think tank report, every corporate statement opposing our agenda, it's all funded by people who don't want to pay taxes. The political jujitsu was masterful. Mamdani had transformed billionaire opposition from a potential weakness into his greatest strength. He wasn't just running against local politicians, he was running against American oligarchy itself. The media response was immediate and devastating for the billionaire conspiracy. When voters learned that their opposition was funded by people worth hundreds of billions of dollars, the attacks backfired spectacularly. The New York Times editorial board wrote, "When 28 billionaires spend $100 million to defeat one mayoral candidate, voters should ask whose interests are really being served by this unprecedented intervention in local democracy." The New York Post, despite its conservative editorial stance, criticized the billionaire conspiracy. Secret committees of ultra-wealthy individuals attempting to control mayoral elections represent everything wrong with American politics. Even Wall Street Journal coverage was skeptical. The Committee to Preserve New York's massive spending raises serious questions about oligarchic influence in democratic elections. The billionaire conspiracy had become a bigger story than the election itself. Instead of stopping Mamdani, their opposition had elevated him to national prominence and validated his central argument about concentrated wealth versus democratic governance. October 25, 2025. Bloomberg called an emergency meeting of the Committee to Preserve New York. The same 47th floor conference room that had hosted their confident September planning now witnessed panic damage control. "Our strategy has backfired completely," Bloomberg admitted, his voice betraying frustration that money couldn't solve this particular problem. "Mamdani has turned our opposition into his campaign's greatest asset." The polling data was devastating. Mamdani had surged from 34% in September to 47% in late October, with most of his gains coming directly from voters who'd learned about billionaire opposition to his campaign. "The more people learn about our involvement, the more they support Mamdani," reported Bill Ackman, reviewing focus group data that showed their worst fears realized. "We've accidentally validated every argument he's made about billionaire influence in politics." Alice Walton raised the obvious question: do we cut our losses and withdraw from the race? Bloomberg's answer revealed the trap they'd created for themselves. "We can't withdraw without confirming everything Mamdani has said about our conspiracy, but we can't continue spending without making his arguments more credible." The billionaires had painted themselves into a corner. Any action they took, continuing their campaign or abandoning it, would benefit Mamdani's narrative about oligarchic opposition to democratic governance. Stephen Ross suggested a final desperate strategy. What if we acknowledge our involvement but frame it as responsible civic engagement rather than conspiracy? The suggestion revealed how completely they'd lost control of the narrative. They were reduced to hoping voters would see billionaire election interference as civic engagement rather than oligarchic manipulation. Mark Zuckerberg, still attending virtually, delivered the fatal assessment. "The data shows that every dollar we spend generates negative returns. Our opposition is literally helping Mamdani's campaign more than our absence would." The billionaires had achieved the impossible, spending money to help elect the candidate they were trying to defeat. November 4, 2025, Election Day. The Committee to Preserve New York had spent their full $103 million, but polling suggested their money had backfired catastrophically. Exit polls showed that 67% of Mamdani voters cited billionaire opposition as a factor in their decision. At Bloomberg's 47th floor conference room, the same 28 billionaires who'd confidently plotted Mamdani's defeat 2 months earlier now watched their worst nightmare unfold in real time. 7 p.m. polls closed. Early returns from Manhattan showed Mamdani performing better than expected in wealthy neighborhoods where billionaire-funded advertising had been heaviest. 7:30 p.m. Brooklyn results confirmed the trend. Voters who'd been exposed to the most anti-Mamdani spending were supporting him at higher rates than voters in areas with less billionaire involvement. 8 p.m. Queens numbers made the pattern undeniable. The billionaire conspiracy had backfired so completely that their spending was positively correlated with Mamdani's support. 8:30 p.m. Bronx returns showed Mamdani winning by unprecedented margins. Working-class voters had responded to billionaire opposition by rallying around the candidate oligarchs opposed. 9 p.m. Staten Island, traditionally the most conservative borough, showed Mamdani running competitively in neighborhoods where no Democratic candidate had been viable for decades. 9:30 p.m. The mathematical reality became clear. Mamdani wasn't just winning, he was winning by the largest margin in a competitive New York mayoral election since 1969. 10:08 Portic photo for the Wio PM, Watt or Upshale PM, 11:04 PM. Social media erupted with celebration as Billionaires Lost became the top trending hashtag worldwide. 11:47 p.m. Mamdani's victory speech at the Brooklyn Museum was carried live by every major network. The billionaires watched in stunned silence as their 100 million TED helped elect their worst enemy. Tonight, New Yorkers sent a clear message to the 28 billionaires who spent over $100 million trying to stop our campaign. Mamdani declared to thunderous applause. Your money can't buy our democracy. Your wealth can't purchase our city. And your conspiracy can't defeat our movement. The billionaires had funded their own humiliation. Their secret committee had become public knowledge. Their massive spending had validated every argument about oligarchic influence. Their opposition had become Mamdani's greatest campaign asset. In the Bloomberg conference room, the silence was deafening. 28 of America's wealthiest individuals sat in stunned recognition that their money had become powerless against Democratic opposition. How did this happen? Alice Walton asked, voicing the question that would haunt them for years. Bloomberg's answer was bitter and accurate. We proved Mamdani's point about billionaire influence so convincingly that voters rejected everything we represented. The final tally was devastating. Mamdani 58%, Adams 35%, other candidates 7%. The billionaire conspiracy had helped elect a Democratic Socialist mayor by the largest margin in modern New York history. November 5, 2025. The morning after analysis revealed the full scope of the billionaires' failure. And their $100.3 million in spending had generated negative returns more spectacular than any investment loss in their business careers. Campaign finance experts calculated that the billionaire opposition had actually added 8 to 12 percentage points to Mamdani's victory margin. Without their involvement, the race might have been competitive. With their opposition, it became a landslide. The New York Times published a comprehensive analysis titled, How $100 Million in Opposition Elected the Candidate Billionaires Opposed. The article documented how every element of the conspiracy had backfired. Their super PAC advertising had prompted counter-advertising that made Mamdani more popular. Their think tank studies had generated academic rebuttals that strengthened his policy arguments. Their corporate pressure had created business community backlash that supported his agenda. Their grassroots theater had been exposed as astroturf that discredited elite opposition. Most importantly, their secrecy had created a conspiracy narrative that transformed local municipal politics into a national symbol of democracy versus oligarchy. Wall Street Journal coverage was equally damaging. The Committee to Preserve New York's $100 million failure represents the largest political miscalculation by business leaders since corporate opposition to the New Deal. Even conservative media acknowledged the strategic disaster. Fox News business coverage noted, when billionaire opposition becomes a campaign asset for the candidate you're opposing, you've fundamentally misunderstood democratic politics. The billionaire's wealth had become worthless against democratic opposition. Their influence had been revealed as an illusion maintained by public ignorance rather than actual power. Their conspiracy had destroyed itself through its own exposure. Financial markets reflected the billionaire's defeat. Real estate stocks dropped 12% on news of Mamdani's victory. Luxury retail fell 8%. Financial services declined 6%. The very sectors that had funded his opposition were being punished by investors who understood that billionaire influence had failed. But the most significant impact was psychological. For the first time in decades, American oligarchs had been defeated by Democratic opposition that rejected their money, exposed their influence, and celebrated their failure. International reaction was swift and symbolic. The BBC called Mamdani's victory a triumph for democratic capitalism over oligarchic socialism. European media noted that American voters had rejected billionaire influence more decisively than European voters had rejected traditional aristocracy. The Financial Times published an editorial titled When Money Can't Buy Democracy. The Committee to Preserve New York's spectacular failure demonstrates that concentrated wealth remains vulnerable to organized democratic opposition. Chinese state media, always eager to highlight American contradictions, noted, 28 billionaires spent $100 million and accidentally proved that American democracy can still function despite oligarchic opposition. The propaganda was effective because it was accurate. The billionaires had inadvertently demonstrated that democratic institutions could constrain concentrated wealth when voters understood what was at stake. December 1, 2025. 1 month after their devastating defeat, the Committee to Preserve New York held its final meeting. The same Bloomberg conference room that had hosted confident planning and panic damage control now witnessed bitter recrimination and strategic autopsy. We need to understand exactly how $100 million in political spending helped elect the candidate we were trying to defeat, Bloomberg said, his voice carrying none of the confidence that had characterized their September meeting. The post-mortem was brutal and comprehensive. Political consultants hired by the billionaires had produced a detailed analysis of their strategic failures. First, they had underestimated Mamdani's political sophistication. Rather than defensively responding to their attacks, he had offensively exposed their conspiracy and turned their opposition into his campaign's centerpiece. Second, they had overestimated New York voters' receptivity to billionaire influence. In an era of growing inequality and democratic backsliding, voters were more suspicious of concentrated wealth than the billionaires had realized. Third, they had created a coordination problem that exposed their conspiracy. By establishing 17 separate super PACs managed by the same consultants, they had left paper trails that Mamdani's research team could follow and expose. Fourth, they had fundamentally misunderstood modern media dynamics. In an era of social media and viral content, their opposition had become content for Mamdani's campaign rather than effective attacks against it. Most importantly, they had validated every argument about oligarchic influence by actually engaging in oligarchic influence. Their conspiracy had proved Mamdani's point more effectively than any campaign strategy could have achieved. The irony is perfect, observed venture capitalist Peter Thiel, who joined the conspiracy late and regretted it immediately. We spent $100 million to prove that billionaires shouldn't influence elections. The final assessment was devastating. The Committee to Preserve New York had achieved the exact opposite of every strategic objective. Instead of defeating Mamdani, they had elected him. Instead of discrediting his agenda, they had validated it. Instead of preserving billionaire influence, they had destroyed it. Alice Walton raised the obvious question, what do we do now? How do we engage in politics after this failure? Bloomberg's answer was bitter and resigned. We probably don't. At least not obviously. This failure will be studied for decades as an example of how not to exercise political influence. The billionaires were discussing their own political obsolescence. Their influence had been so thoroughly discredited that future involvement in elections would likely backfire as spectacularly as their New York conspiracy. January 1, 2026. Zohran Mamdani was sworn in as the 11/110th mayor of New York City in a ceremony held at the Brooklyn Museum, the same location where he delivered his victory speech celebrating the billionaire's defeat. The inauguration drew international attention as a symbol of democratic resistance to oligarchic influence. Representatives from progressive parties worldwide attended to study Mamdani's successful campaign against concentrated wealth.
In his inaugural address, Mamdani paid tribute to the billionaires who'd inadvertently helped elect him. I want to thank the 28 billionaires who spent over $100 million, demonstrating exactly why we need campaign finance reform, wealth taxes, and democratic accountability. The audience erupted in sustained applause and laughter. The billionaires had become a punchline in their own political tragedy. Their opposition taught New Yorkers an invaluable lesson. When oligarchs unite to stop democratic change, it's probably worth supporting. Mamdani continued. They've shown us that concentrated wealth is more fragile than it appears, that democratic power is stronger than money, and that transparency defeats conspiracy every time. The inaugural celebration continued late into the evening, with working-class New Yorkers dancing in the streets while billionaires sat in their penthouses contemplating their political irrelevance. At Bloomberg's apartment overlooking Central Park, the former mayor watched inauguration coverage with a mixture of fascination and horror. His $100 million conspiracy had created exactly the political outcome he tried to prevent. We didn't just lose an election, Bloomberg told his assembled guests, who included several Committee to Preserve New York members. We lost the ability to influence elections without being counterproductive. The assessment was accurate and terrifying for people whose power had always depended on political influence. The billionaires had revealed their conspiracy so thoroughly that future political involvement would carry the stigma of oligarchic manipulation. March 15, 2026. 3 months into Mamdani's administration, the billionaires' worst fears were being realized. The wealth tax had passed the city council unanimously. Rent stabilization covered 1.2 million apartments. Corporate subsidies had been eliminated. Affordable housing construction had doubled. Every policy they'd spent $100 million opposing was being implemented with broad public support and minimal resistance. Their opposition had been so discredited that business groups couldn't effectively organize against Mamdani's agenda. The New York Times published a comprehensive analysis titled How Billionaire Opposition Created Progressive Paradise. The article documented how the conspiracy's exposure had given Mamdani unprecedented political capital to implement his full agenda without significant opposition.
When 28 billionaires spend $100 million to stop you, voters assume your policies must threaten concentrated wealth in favor of working families, explained Columbia political scientist Kathleen Bond. Mamdani didn't just win election, he won a mandate for comprehensive reform. The billionaires had achieved the impossible. They'd created the political conditions for successful democratic socialism in America's largest city. Wall Street analysts were studying the Bloomberg effect as a cautionary tale about political intervention. When concentrated wealth engaged in obvious political conspiracy, it validated rather than discredited arguments about oligarchic influence. The Committee to Preserve New York became the Committee to elect Zohran Mamdani, wrote Financial Times columnist Martin Wolf. Their failure demonstrates that democratic institutions can constrain concentrated wealth when voters understand what's happening. June 1, 2026. 6 months after their election defeat, the billionaires faced a new reality. Their political influence had been permanently damaged by their spectacular failure. Campaign finance reports showed that corporate political donations had dropped 40% nationwide as business leaders feared being associated with oligarchic manipulation. The Bloomberg effect was spreading beyond New York. Progressive candidates across the country were highlighting billionaire opposition as proof of their reform credentials. Wealthy donors were finding their political involvement increasingly counterproductive. Michael Bloomberg, the architect of the failed conspiracy, published a remarkable op-ed in the Washington Post titled "How I Learned That Money Can't Buy Democracy." Our $100 million effort to defeat Zohran Mamdani was the worst strategic decision of my political career. We proved his arguments about oligarchic influence more effectively than his campaign ever could. We validated every criticism of concentrated wealth while helping elect a mayor committed to constraining that wealth. The public apology was stunning from someone who'd never admitted political failure. Bloomberg was acknowledging that Democratic opposition had defeated oligarchic influence through transparency, organization, and voter education. The lesson for other wealthy Americans is clear, Bloomberg continued. Obvious political intervention by billionaires now backfires so predictably that it's politically counterproductive. We've accidentally strengthened democracy by revealing how oligarchy actually works. The op-ed was widely seen as Bloomberg's political obituary. The man who'd spent decades influencing elections through wealth was admitting that his influence had become a liability rather than an asset. December 31, 2026. 1 year after their failed conspiracy, the Committee to Preserve New York had effectively disbanded. Several members had withdrawn from political activity entirely. Others had shifted to anonymous donations that avoided the billionaire association that had become politically toxic. The final accounting was brutal. $100.3 million in spending had generated the largest political backfire in American history. The billionaires had helped elect a Democratic Socialist mayor, validated arguments about oligarchic influence, discredited concentrated wealth in politics, and created precedent for democratic resistance to money power. Their failure had become a case study in political science programs worldwide. Students learned how transparent democracy could defeat secret oligarchy, how voter education could constrain concentrated wealth, and how conspiracy could destroy itself through exposure. Mamdani's first year as mayor had been remarkably successful, precisely because billionaire opposition had given him political capital that most mayors never achieved. His approval ratings remained above 70%. His policies enjoyed broad support. His national profile had made him a leading voice for democratic socialism. The mayor the billionaires had tried to destroy had become the most successful progressive politician in America, largely because their opposition had validated his arguments about democracy versus oligarchy. On New Year's Eve 2026, as Mamdani delivered remarks at Brooklyn's Grand Army Plaza celebrating his first year in office, he reflected on the billionaires who'd inadvertently made his success possible. Sometimes the greatest enemies of democracy accidentally become its greatest teachers, he said to cheers from thousands of New Yorkers. 28 billionaires spent $100 million to show us exactly why concentrated wealth threatens democratic governance. They've taught us that transparency defeats conspiracy, that organization conquers money, and that democracy is stronger than oligarchy when people understand what's at stake. The crowd erupted in celebration as fireworks lit up the Brooklyn sky. The billionaires watched from their penthouses, contemplating their spectacular failure and its lasting consequences for American democracy. They had spent $100 million to stop one man and accidentally strengthened the democratic institutions they'd tried to corrupt. Their conspiracy had become democracy's greatest victory in decades. Sometimes the most effective way to defeat oligarchy is to let oligarchs reveal themselves. The Committee to Preserve New York had done exactly that, and American democracy was stronger for their failure. Money had met democracy, and democracy had won.